The news broke that California's Indy McBank had closed down and was labeled a total disaster. That same night, Washington called an emergency meeting. Over at GTX, Bobby walked into his office while his assistant Nan followed him, letting him know that Sally Wilcox was waiting in the conference room. Bobby headed to the staff room where everyone looked pretty down. When he asked what was wrong, nobody would tell him. So he went to Connell's office to ask if someone had died. Connell explained they'd shut down the mobile phone division in Newport News and combined the ship system with a rail product. Basically corporate talk for cutting jobs while making it sound like progress. Bobby then went to Sally's office to find out what was happening. Sally introduced him to Dick Landry from legal, who told him that the company had made a division change and would give Bobby benefits for his 12 years with them. Bobby angrily asked if he was being fired. Sally assured him they'd also provide help with finding new work. Bobby refused to sit down when asked and just walked out. One day, he'd been like Bruce Wayne running Wayne Enterprises. The next, he was just Bobby Walker standing outside GTX holding a cardboard box. Even Batman couldn't escape getting laid off. Bobby started packing up his stuff. His secretary asked what they'd said about her job, but he admitted he hadn't asked. Over at Jean's office, Phil was waiting. Jean noticed Phil seemed off and asked what was going on. His assistant mentioned that Sally had fired some people from the ship systems sales group. Jean asked if Phil got fired too, but Phil said no, and admitted he'd been hiding in the office all day. Phil yelled that he would never let anyone fire him after 30 years with the company. 30 years of loyalty gone in 30 seconds. Turned out the dedication didn't mean job security. Back at Bobby's place, his wife Maggie came outside and saw the Bobby cooking. She asked why he was home so early, and he told her he was making dinner. Maggie reminded him they were supposed to go to Jack's that night, but Bobby refused. Maggie got upset and went inside. Bobby followed her, and they started arguing about why he wasn't going, and why he supposedly hated Jack. Bobby finally told her he'd been fired that day. Maggie asked about Jean, reminding Bobby that Jean had promised to keep his job safe. Bobby explained that Jean hadn't been in the office all day and that Sally Wilcox had made the call. It was crazy how fast "we're in this together" turned into "sorry, nothing I can do." Meanwhile, Phil got home and asked his daughter Susan Rico where her mom was. She told him her mom had a headache. As Phil was about to go upstairs, his daughter mentioned they'd found out their next trip would be to Italy and asked if she could go too. Phil said she would, but he wasn't sure anymore. A vacation to Italy sounded awesome if you still had a job to come back to. Phil went to the bedroom, and when his wife saw him, she asked if he'd heard that Colin got fired and whether they were okay. Phil assured her they were fine, and reminded her they needed to get ready for Salinger's dinner. When your financial world was falling apart, the best solution was apparently to dress up for a fancy dinner. At the same time, Jean stood there numbly putting ice in his bottle. His wife came up behind him and told him they had to leave early, reminding him they shouldn't be late again. Bobby, Maggie, and their kids arrived at Jack's house. They went inside and said hi to everyone. Jack asked Bobby how he was handling the transition from his high-paying job to another one. While they were talking, the birthday lady came in, and Bobby told her she didn't look 35, but more like 21. They both laughed, and she invited Bobby to have a drink. They had margaritas in the blender they got at the Man of the Year celebration. The host introduced Gene McClary, Executive Vice President of GTX, as one of its first employees. Gene took the stage talking about his patience during tough times for the company and praising James for growing GTX into a huge organization. Gene then invited James to come up. James thanked everyone and acknowledged that building GTX wasn't easy, but was made possible with Jane's help. Handing out pink slips by the thousands and then patting yourself on the back for visionary leadership seemed like something a villain would do. Even Lex Luthor would be taking notes. The next day, Bobby went to a job training. When he got there, Danny met him and asked where he was going. Bobby mentioned he was heading to orientation, and Danny pointed him to the room. Inside, a woman told them what they needed to do for their job search and that fear and anxiety were actually helpful when looking for work. Neighbors, dentists, literally anybody could be a potential lead. Back at GTX, Gene and the rest of the staff talked about merging the ship systems and rail products divisions. Phil and Nan joined them as everyone complained about handling the same number of accounts with half the people. Phil told them they were lucky to have jobs these days, then changed the subject to how they could win back the business. Bobby left the orientation and looked for somewhere to sit. When he found a spot, a worker told him the seat was taken. Danny then called Bobby over, offered him a seat, and Bobby thanked him before sitting down. Danny explained that everyone was scared of Bobby because he was new. Bobby asked Danny why he wasn't afraid, and Danny said he was just confident like that. Danny asked Bobby how long his severance would last, and Bobby explained it was 3 months full pay and 4 months of job placement help. Danny mentioned he had 9 months but had already used 4. It was like a countdown. seeing how long you could stretch those months before the real panic kicked in. Later, Jean and Bobby met for lunch. Jean asked how things were going for Bobby and his family, and Bobby said everything was fine. Jean explained they had to make cuts because the company was in serious trouble and they needed to reduce staff. Salinger was under pressure to get the stock price up before somebody bought the company and fired Jean. Jean told Bobby he'd called some marketers, gave him their names on a paper, and wished him luck. Bobby got angry, dropped the paper, and left, saying he'd steal their clients once he started working with their competitors. Bobby had gone from company man to revenge mode in record time. At home, Maggie and Bobby talked about his meeting with Jean. Bobby mentioned Jean was helping him connect with marketers, and Maggie seemed impressed. While holding a stack of unpaid bills, Maggie suggested getting a job herself to help with expenses. When Bobby's dad Kevin called, Maggie handed him the phone, but Bobby refused to take it, not wanting to hear his advice. At the office, James and Jean remembered good times. James invited Jean and Cynthia to join them at Sun Valley for New Year's, but Jean hesitated, saying his grandkid would be visiting. At home, Jean was lying outside when Cynthia came over and asked if everything was okay. He mentioned having lunch with Bobby and expecting Bobby to throw a drink in his face. Cynthia said she and Sue were planning a weekend trip to Palm Beach and asked for the corporate jet. Seeing Jean's reaction, she quickly added they would just take commercial flights instead. Meanwhile, Maggie brought up the idea of selling their house, but Bobby refused, saying they weren't going to get stuck. He then headed to an interview, driving separately while Maggie took the kids. Bruce Wayne would just buy another mansion without thinking twice, but Bobby Walker was desperately holding on to a life he could no longer afford, hoping nobody would notice. The interviewer looked over his experience in sales and asked about regional sales, which he confirmed. She offered $65,000 a year for a position outside his area. Angry Bobby argued he made $120,000 at GTX and had applied for vice president of marketing. She replied they had really qualified applicants, to which he insisted he was one of them. After this, Bobby went to the office and started calling marketers about job openings, but all the responses were negative. Phil Knight had built Nike from nothing into a billion-dollar company, but Bobby Walker would be lucky to sell sneakers out of his trunk just to pay rent. Bobby kept calling Sally, leaving messages when she'd pick up. Bobby went back home to find Drew sitting alone outside. Bobby asked what was wrong, and Drew assured him he could handle things since he was growing up. Bobby then told him he'd lost his job, but promised everything would be okay. At Jack's house for Thanksgiving, the guys discussed business while food was being served. Jack asked Bobby about work, and Bobby gave a vague answer. Jack mentioned reading that Salinger made 700 times more than the average GTX worker, a timely reminder that the ones at the top rarely felt the pain of those at the bottom. Before eating, Carson said grace, thanking God for their health and asking for her dad to find a job, accidentally exposing Bobby's unemployment to everyone. Jack offered Bobby a job, but he turned it down. James and his business partner were talking about money problems and had to make a tough choice: sell their new business, shut down the existing one, or let people go. They went with layoffs. Gene told James privately that he didn't agree, but James just brushed him off. Typical corporate move: cut workers first instead of executive pay or restructuring. That night, Maggie and Bobby were in bed discussing their finances. Maggie mentioned they could get $850,000 for their house if they lowered the price a bit. She asked Bobby why he wouldn't take Jack's job offer. Bobby said he couldn't work under Jack. His pride was all he had left, and he was hanging onto it desperately. In another bedroom, Gene and Sally were also talking. Gene asked about the layoff criteria, which annoyed Sally so much she left him alone in bed. The next day, Bobby went golfing with a teammate but got embarrassed when they told him his membership hadn't been paid. He went to Maggie asking what was going on. She explained they couldn't afford next month's payment and told him to quit golfing and find work to pay their mortgage. Bobby wanted to keep up appearances, but Maggie reminded him of their reality and asked him to cancel his golf plans. Nothing screams "I'm broke" like getting kicked off the golf course. Later, Bobby and Maggie had a heart-to-heart. Bobby felt hopeless, yelling that at 37 he couldn't even support his family. Maggie comforted him, saying everything would be okay and that his family had his back. She gave him a much-needed hug. Bobby went to another job interview. The interviewer mentioned a great recommendation from Dan Mass and said the job paid $90,000 plus commission and bonuses. The guy told Bobby that while he couldn't promise anything, with Dan's recommendation and Bobby's resume, he seemed perfect for the job. Finally, some hope. But when Bobby called later about the position, it had been filled. Later, Bobby watched sadly as someone drove away in the car he just sold. First the golf membership, now the car. His old life was disappearing bit by bit. At a party, Phil told Gene that Sally had fired him. Gene went to his office to confront Sally, who handed him his own termination papers. Gene and Phil talked about how they'd given years to the company only to be betrayed. When Gene got home, he ignored his wife's calls to come upstairs. Phil started a new job on the factory floor. At Joanna's office, she surprised Bobby and the team by asking Phil if he smoked. When he said sometimes, she told him to quit because at his age, the job market would be brutal. Bobby went to Phil's new tiny office and mentioned the company had to pay extra for it. Phil said it was the least they could do. Phil asked about the dress code and Bobby told him casual was fine. At home, Bobby was on the phone with the mortgage company, saying he'd send them a check for the missed payment. Maggie came downstairs smiling and asked who he was talking to. Bobby told her it was the mortgage company. Maggie mentioned that Ted asked her to work on New Year's Eve. Just then, Drew came down and asked Bobby for a ride to Kyle's house. Bobby said he was busy, and Drew went back upstairs disappointed. Bobby offered to play Xbox with Drew, but Maggie told him Drew had returned his Xbox because he knew they couldn't afford it. Nothing hurts more than seeing your kid quietly give up something they love because they notice you're struggling. Bobby swallowed his pride and went to Jack's construction site asking for work. He started that day, struggling to carry timber while Jack worked. Bobby got tired and Jack told him to carry 2 more. He'd played rich guys on screen, but now he was just a dude having trouble with a 2x4. Talk about a reality check. During lunch, Bobby sat alone looking at his blistered hands. One of Jack's workers came over and told him the blisters were from using new gloves, then gave Bobby his old pair. A small gesture that meant a lot. Bobby wasn't just learning carpentry, he was learning humility. The next morning, Bobby was sandblasting at work. They told him to add another sack because the mix was too thin. Jack sarcastically commented on how easy the job was compared to moving cost reports around an office. Meanwhile, Gene and Sally were at his house. She asked about his plans and mentioned that her old friends Ed and Dana had invited them to dinner. Phil went to an interview where he found a long line of applicants waiting. The receptionist just told him to sign in and take a seat. Jack gave Bobby his paycheck, which had an extra $200. When Bobby pointed this out, Jack said it might be a mistake, but told him to keep it anyway. Gene went to dinner with Sally and her friends, pretending to have a good time while clearly miserable. He was still acting like he had control, when really he had none. Bobby's family moved into his parents' house. Bobby went to check on Drew, who was lying in bed with earphones. Bobby asked if Drew was okay sharing a room with his sister for a while, and Drew said it was fine. Once upon a time, Bobby bought sneakers without checking the price. Now he was deciding which ones to sell just to make ends meet. Liam and his family visited Gene. While the family played outside, Gene told Liam he was trying to get a vineyard and looking for work. Liam asked if Gene had talked to his mother, saying she was having a tough time and thinking about selling the house. At work, Bobby learned Mike wasn't there because he'd been arrested for assault and being drunk and disorderly. Bobby told Jack he knew someone who could work for them. Soon after, Danny joined the team, another office worker now picking up a hammer instead of a briefcase. Gene found Phil drinking at a bar and offered him a ride home. Phil said he couldn't go home because his wife didn't want the neighbors knowing he'd been fired, so he suggested they catch a movie instead. When Bobby got home, his mother told him someone named Fred Mund had called with a job offer. Even though it was in Boston, Bobby decided to go for it. Maggie was skeptical, but Bobby said the vice president of sales and marketing position was perfect for him. It seemed too good to be true, and it was. Bobby went to Boston and stayed in a motel. The next morning, he went for his interview, only to find out his appointment was for the following week, not that day. Phil met James for lunch and brought up a job opening for foreign executives. James told him they wouldn't hire anyone over 30 for that job. Apparently, decades of experience meant nothing if you weren't young enough. Later that night, Gene found Phil angrily throwing stones at the GTX building. Phil talked about his money troubles, but there was nothing they could do about it. Back home, Phil washed the dishes, then went to his garage to smoke. He got in his car, closed the garage door, started the engine, and killed himself with carbon monoxide poisoning. The next day, Gene, Bobby, and others attended Phil's funeral, a tragic but increasingly common end for those who felt they'd lost everything. Afterward, Bobby and Gene walked through their first workplace. Gene reminisced about the old days, but now everything he'd spent 30 years building for himself and others was gone. Bobby went home and apologized to Maggie for letting her down. She assured him this tough time would pass. The next day, Gene went to GTX to confront James about missing Phil's funeral. James just talked about Phil's wife instead. Gene asked why James had fired people when the company was doing well, but James insisted it was necessary for the company's survival. just what the market demanded. Bobby got a call from Gene about a job offer. Later, he told Jack about it, but said he was thinking of staying because he preferred construction work. Jack told him to take Gene's job because honestly, Bobby was a terrible carpenter. Gene had started his own company called MLAR Maritime Associates. Sally stopped by his office to congratulate him and asked about having lunch, but Gene turned her down. As she was leaving, she asked him to consider her for any associate positions, emphasizing her new energy. Bobby walked into his new office and greeted the employees. He immediately started giving orders and got to work. He was back in the corporate world, but with a fresh perspective. He assured everyone things were going to be okay. If you like this movie, you'll love what's waiting next. Unmissable anime stories that hit even harder. Tap the screen and don't miss out.